All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of my unending hope that students will understand the material that's in AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies and AWD 1111 Database-Driven Websites. All right, and I should really check and make sure that is the name of that. So give me a second here. As I keep saying it, all right. So AWD 1111 is called Database-Driven Web Development. All right, so as part of those two classes, I've been going through creating a series of videos based on the ebooks by Mr. Flavio Copes. So far, I have gone through it's not letting me put there. That's lovely. There we go. I've gone through his HTML handbook. I've gone through his CSS handbook. I've gone through his JavaScript Beginner's Handbook, which puts me on number 4 of 7, which is JavaScript from ES5 to ES Next. Here is where we are kind of transitioning most of the material that I went through in the first 3 ebooks is more relevant towards the AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies class. But starting here, this is more complex JavaScript. And from here, we're going to go on and go through Copes's Node handbook, followed by his Express handbook, followed by his React handbook. All right, so JavaScript from ES5 to ES Next. You'll notice there's going to be some duplication in here from some of the material that was covered in the last set of videos. Now, what's different? This basically, notice ES 2015. So this is the newer perspective. All right, you might say, well, we're in 2021. Yeah, but some of the biggest changes to JavaScript started with ES 2015. Such things as arrow functions, classes, destructuring, the for of loop, promises, the spread operator, set, and map. Then in 2016, we had the array.prototype.includes, the new exponentiation operator. 2017, object.values, object.entries, async functions. 2018, REST spread properties, asynchronous iteration, improvements to regular expressions. And then we've got ES Next. And as far as I know, ES Next is kind of the way that we're referring to JavaScript from present onward, so into the future. All right. So again, you can see there are some JSON improvements, and there's other stuff. All right. This is 84 pages in length, and we're up to page 4. So as Copes says here, I wrote this book to help you move from pre-ES6 knowledge of JavaScript and get you quickly up to speed with the most recent advancements of the language. So that is solely what this particular ebook concentrates on. All right. The future of JavaScript is going to be brilliant. Well, you know what? It's popular, and it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere. The author says here, my goal is to give you a quick yet comprehensive overview of the new stuff available to us. All right. So whenever you read about JavaScript, you'll inevitably see one of these. I'm not going to look at any of those. But I do want to say that, as we go down and you look at the bottom, ECMA is the European Computer Manufacturers Association. All right. And as far as that goes, they're the basic governing body for JavaScript. And I don't mean that the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and the watt.wg, that they don't have their own stake in this, because they do. All right? But it's basically ECMA. And so as it says, when you refer to ECMAScript, that's what the ECMA is. It's the standard, as mentioned there, upon which JavaScript is based. And there's other languages that are in there. I'm not even going to read any of that. All right? JavaScript is the most popular and widely used of these ECMAScripts or ESs. All right. When JavaScript was created, it was presented by NetScript and Sun Microsystems to ECMA, and they gave it the name ECMA 262, as it says, in other words, ECMAScript. The current version is ES 2018, released 3 years ago. All right. TC39 is mentioned there as the committee that evolves JavaScript. The members are companies involved in JavaScript and your major browser players. You can read that yourself on there. The versions, the author says, I found it puzzling why sometimes an ES version is referenced by edition number and sometimes by year. I agree with that. And it says, why does this happen? During the process that led to ES 2015, the name was changed from ES6 to ES 2015. Since that was done late, people still referenced it as ES6. So it looks a little weird, for lack of better words. But there's the timeline that goes from newest to earliest. All right, so we're starting here with 2015. Okay? Let and const, we've kind of beat these to death. As it mentions right there, prior to ES 2015, you used var for defining variables. You could use const, but back then, if you declared a variable named const or a constant named const, and a constant is just a type of variable, but it's a type of variable that typically cannot change. But when you use const prior to 2015, it would recognize it as a keyword in most editors, but you could still go and actually change the value of a const after you set it, even for a simple or primitive variable. So it wasn't much good, to be honest with you. All right. Back in the day, as it says there, if you were using var, but you forgot to use the word var, okay, it says you're assigning a value to an undeclared variable and the results could vary. Well, in modern environments, you should always be putting the using strict, and I believe that that's actually implied now with ES 2015 and above, but it never hurts to put that in there. Using strict at the top of your program. Because again, what that does is if you create variables and start to use them before you've declared them, so if you start to use variables before you've declared them, you're going to get error messages. All right. If you don't initialize a variable when you declare it, it has a value of undefined. We've talked about that before. You can redeclare a variable many times. Now, this is wrong. You can't do this. You can say var a equal 1 and then later say a equal 2. But I don't believe even back in 2015 you could do it like this. Now, I know that's the way it is with let, and I thought that's the way it was with var. If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. But either way, you should not be using var. All right. As mentioned here, the scope of the variable is the portion of code where it's visible. And as they say right there, a variable that's been initialized with var outside of any function is assigned to the global object, which means it's got global scope, which means it's available to the whole program without having to pass it around. On the other hand, if you initialize a variable with var inside of a function, it's global or local. I'm sorry, not global. It is local to that function. Now, can it still be used in other functions? The answer is actually yes, but you have to pass it in. Any variable defined in a function, so if it's defined any local variable, what they're saying, with the same name as a global variable, shadows it. In other words, you can't see the global one anymore. All right. They mention here that it's important to understand that a block is something, whatever you put, the code you put in between a set of curly braces, does not define a new scope. A new scope is only created when a function is created. var does not have block scope, var has function scope. So block scope is what's between the curly braces. Now, unlike var, let does have block scope. Kind of interesting, inside of a function, so any variable defined or any local variable is visible throughout all of the function code. Even if it's declared at the end of the function, it can still be referenced at the beginning. And the reason for that is JavaScript, for lack of better words, kind of behind the scenes, moves all the variables to the top, and it's known as variable hoisting. All right, so you should only be using let today, actually let or const. You should never be using var. There is not a reason to do that. So let is defined here as a feature, a new feature, 6 years ago in ES 2015. Again, it's block scoped. So if you define a variable using let between a set of curly braces, whether that is inside of a function or inside of an if or inside of a while loop, etc., it's available inside of those curly braces. It says modern JavaScript developers might choose to only use let and completely discard the use of var, and I think they should. Defining let outside of any variable, contrary to var, does not create a global variable. Well, I'm not going to disagree with Mr. Copes here, but I will tell you that I've used let at the top of programs and then have used it throughout the rest of the program inside of different functions without having to pass it in. To me, that does signify global scope. Now, if you have variables that you know are not going to change when the program or as the program runs. So once they're set, it's the old idea of set it and forget it. They should be set as const. All right, then you don't have to worry about it being reset when it shouldn't be. And as Cope says down here, modern JavaScript developers might choose to always use const for variables that don't need to be reassigned later, because we should always use the simplest construct available for making errors, to avoid making errors down the road. Now, another new thing here is arrow functions. Now look at this, because this is a great example right here. It really is. What we're saying here is we've replaced this right there, the function paren, with this right there. In a nutshell, that's what we have with arrow functions. And as it says, since their introduction, they have forever changed how JavaScript looks and works. Cope says here, in my opinion, this change was so welcoming that you now rarely see this top usage. It's almost always done like this. And again, if the function contains just one statement, you can do it like this. All right. Parameters, as it says, are passed in parentheses. However, if you have only one parameter, you can still put it in parens, or you can omit the parens. Whichever you're more comfortable doing is totally legit. It says, thanks to this short syntax, arrow functions encourage the use of smaller functions. That's always a good thing. You know, somebody asked me a long time ago, we were talking about the C programming language, and I was teaching it. This was many, many years ago. But we were talking about why writing functions is a good thing. And I said writing functions and having a function-based type of language says that, for example, if you have an application that's going to have, let's say, 500 lines of code in it, it's much better to have 50 functions, 10 lines each on average, than it is to have 10 functions, 50 lines each. Because the bigger the function gets, it's not so much code bloat, but what happens is the bigger the function gets, ideally a function should have one and only one job. But the bigger the function gets, the chances are better that won't happen. People will put more in there. So what do I mean? So imagine, let's grab 5 pieces of information. Your first name, your last name, your address, your city, and your state. Those 5 pieces of information. In a really good modularized program, there'll be 5 different functions. One to handle the input of the first name, one to handle the input of the last name, one to handle the input of the address, one to handle the input of the city, first name, last name, address, city, state. Well, I'll make it 6, city, state, zip. Okay, and one for each one of those fields. Now, do people write like that? To be honest with you, most of the time, no. What's the advantage of writing like that? Well, if you've got a problem, let's say with your city, you know right where to go and you know right where it is. All right? The best programmers that I know, that I've worked with during my life, they have a tendency to write small functions that do one and only one thing. Okay. Again, when there's only one line in there, you can put it all together. It says when you return an object, remember to wrap the curly brackets in parentheses to avoid it being considered the wrapping function body brackets. All right. Let's see. Let's finish this up in this section right here. So how this, and that's this keyword, how this keyword works in the arrow functions. As it says there, this is a concept that's difficult to grasp because it can mean different things depending on how and where it's used. As it says here, it varies a lot depending on context, is what I just said. And also varies depending on the mode of JavaScript, whether you're in strict mode or not strict mode. As mentioned there, it is important to clarify this concept because arrow functions behave differently compared to regular functions. All right. So, as mentioned right here, when defined as a method to an object in a regular function, the word this refers to the object. So you're saying here this dot manufacture and this dot model. So you're referring to the object. So as mentioned there, the this scope with arrow functions is inherited from what's referred to as the execution context. An arrow function does not bind this. So its value, as it says, will be looked up the call stack. So in other words, doing it there with an arrow function, it won't work. Instead of like here where it's going to say Ford Fiesta, because we used the word function there, since here we didn't, we used an arrow function, it's going to print out undefined, undefined. Due to this, as it says, arrow functions, they're not well suited as object methods. So you probably, when you're creating object methods, you probably want to use the older type of syntax. Next, arrow functions cannot be used as constructors either when instantiating an object will raise a type error. Again, this is where regular functions should be used instead, when dynamic context is not needed. All right, there's also a problem when handling events. DOM event listener set this to be the target element. And if you rely on this in an event handler, a regular function is necessary. Like this, as opposed to like that. So notice here, this is equal to the window object, whereas down here, it's equal to the actual link that you want to be working with. All right, now that was quick, down, and dirty. But before we continue on with classes, let's stop this lecture.